Hi, and welcome to Crash Course Catholicism, a podcast about Catholic teaching and why it makes sense. I'm your host, Caitlin West. Hey friends, and welcome to our last episode of the whole year. Also, happy Christmas for in like 3 days. Speaking of Christmas, in this episode, we are going to be talking about St Nicholas of Myra, who is the saint on which the modern day Santa Claus is based. So we're going to spend the first part of this episode talking about this saint, St Nicholas of Myra, who he was, where he came from, and what we know about him. And then we're going to think about how we got from St Nicholas to the modern day Santa Claus. And then we're going to finish by thinking a little bit about the role that Santa Claus plays in Christmas for Catholics and the extent to which Catholics should be encouraging traditions around Santa Claus. Okay, so who is St Nicholas of Myra? Well, what we do know about this saint is that he was born towards the end of the 3rd century AD, died around the mid-4th century. He was Greek, and he was a bishop of the Catholic Church, specifically the bishop of the city of Myra. Now, beyond those basic biographical details, we actually know very, very little about this saint for sure. There's not a lot that we can be certain of about him. The earliest accounts of the life of St Nicholas of Myra weren't written until hundreds of years after his death. So the first complete written biography of St Nicholas that we still have today was composed around the 9th century, so roughly 500 years after St Nicholas' death. Now this biography and many other biographies that sprung up around that time and later on contain multiple stories and legends about the life of St. Nicholas and miracles that he is said to have done. However, because these biographies were written so late, it's not clear how many of these stories are true stories and how many of them are kind of legends that were invented or embellished over time. That's not to say that they're not true, but it's just to say that we don't know for sure whether and which of these stories are actually true. Okay, so we have very little reliable factual information about St. Nicholas of Myra. And aside from the fact that he was an early Christian bishop of Greek descent, we don't know much about him. But despite the absence of kind of hard, reliable evidence about St. Nicholas's life, this saint has historically been one of the most popular saints, not only of the Catholic Church, but also of Eastern Orthodox churches. So in the centuries following his death, numerous legends and stories about St. Nicholas emerged. Many of them contributed to the popularity of St. Nicholas. In the Middle Ages, devotion to St. Nicholas became particularly widespread in the West, and St. Nicholas was often the subject of artworks and liturgical plays. Today he is known as the patron of charitable institutions, children, sailors, and unmarried girls, which might seem like a weird combination of things to be patron of, but as we go through some of the legends about his life, it will become clear why he is the patron of these things. Speaking of which, let's go through some of the legends about St. Nicholas's life, because they are pretty cool and some of them are kind of extra and they are very much worth going over. Okay, so according to St. Nicholas's first biographer, who was writing around the 9th century, Nicholas's parents, who were Christian, were extremely wealthy, and when they died, they left all of their possessions to their son Nicholas. Now, Nicholas was already at a young age a very holy person, and he decided that he didn't want or need that much wealth, and so he decided to dedicate his wealth to serving the poor and the needy, and that is what he did for the rest of his life. He gave away his money and his possessions to people who needed it. So this is one of the reasons why he's considered a patron of charitable institutions. One of the most famous stories about St. Nicholas, which also comes from this 9th century biography, is the story of how St. Nicholas helped to save 3 poor girls from a pretty terrible fate. So the story goes like this. Apparently there was a man living in Nicholas's village who was really poor, kind of through no fault of his own. Like things had gone badly in his life and he didn't have any money. The problem with that was that he had 3 daughters and he was too poor to afford a dowry for his daughters. which meant that his daughters could not get married, which meant at that time that they had no means of providing for themselves and they were going to become destitute. So apparently this father of the 3 daughters was so desperate that he was considering selling his 3 daughters into prostitution. St. Nicholas heard of this and he was so horrified at the idea that these 3 daughters were going to be sold into prostitution that he went to the father's house in the middle of the night, waited until everyone was asleep, and then threw a bag of gold through an open window. And when the family woke up in the morning, this bag of gold was lying in their house and they didn't know where it had come from or who had given it to them, but the money was enough to pay for the dowry of the eldest daughter. St. Nicholas allegedly did this another 2 times, one for each of the 3 daughters. And the 3rd time he did it, the father of the family waited up all night, waiting for this mysterious secret patron to come with his bag of gold. And when St. Nicholas arrived and threw the last bag of gold through the window, the father of the family ran out and threw himself at the feet of St. Nicholas and thanked him for his generosity. So this story is also one of the reasons why St. Nicholas is known as the patron of unmarried girls. Another story of St. Nicholas tells of him saving the lives of 3 children. Now, FYI, this is a story about murder, so if you have small children listening, then maybe skip ahead 30 seconds. So the story goes that a butcher lured 3 children into his house, murdered them, and placed their bodies in a barrel. St. Nicholas heard about what had happened and he prayed over the bodies of the 3 children, made the sign of the cross, and the 3 children were resurrected. Now, this is one of those stories that is probably fiction. It only really appears in the medieval period when St. Nicholas is becoming popular. So there's a good chance that this isn't something that actually happened. However, the fact that it is not true did not stop it from becoming one of the most popular stories about St. Nicholas in the medieval period. And in fact, when you see medieval artworks of St. Nicholas, this is the story that is often depicted. Another story about St. Nicholas, which is slightly less gory, actually occurs hundreds of years after the death of St. Nicholas. The story goes that there was a Greek family who was celebrating the feast of St. Nicholas with their community. And on that day, a group of pirates from Crete arrived on boats and looted the church of St. Nicholas. And in the process of looting that church, they also kidnapped a young boy called Basilios. And they took Basilios with them back to Crete, and the boy was made the official cupbearer of the king. Now, obviously, the boy's parents were completely grief-stricken, and they spent the next year praying for the safe return of their son. And exactly 1 year later, on the feast of St. Nicholas, just as the family were sitting down to their evening meal, they heard a sound outside, and they went outside, and their son was standing there, still holding the king's golden cup. And the boy told his parents that he had been doing his duties as cupbearer to the king when suddenly he saw a vision of St. Nicholas, who comforted him, encouraged him, and gave him a blessing before transporting him back to his parents' home. So these 2 stories were kind of the basis for the devotion to St. Nicholas as patron of children. St. Nicholas is also known as a patron of sailors for a couple of reasons. One is that he is said to have visited the Holy Land, and while he was on his way there, the boat that he was in got into trouble and there was a storm that was threatening the lives of everyone on board. St. Nicholas rebuked the waves, the storm immediately subsided, and the boat arrived safely to shore. There are also stories of sailors themselves praying to St. Nicholas in the middle of storms and the storms suddenly ceasing. So for this reason, St. Nicholas has been venerated as the patron of sailors. Okay, now one final story about St. Nicholas before we move on. And this is another story that kind of highlights St. Nicholas's devotion to the poor and the needy. So apparently around the early 4th century, during that great famine in Myra, there was a ship that was passing through on its way to Constantinople, and it was loaded with grain and wheat to bring to the king. St. Nicholas went to the sailors of the ship and asked them if they would offload part of their grain to give to the starving and the poor in the city of Myra. And the sailors responded that they would love to, but unfortunately they couldn't share their grain because they had promised the king that they would bring a certain amount of grain with them, and it was all going to be weighed when they got there. And so if anything was missing, they would all be put to death. St. Nicholas reassured the sailors and promised them that if they shared their grain with the people, they would not experience any kind of adverse consequences. So the sailors trusted St. Nicholas and offloaded a part of their cargo before continuing on their way. When they arrived arrived in Constantinople and their grain was weighed, the weight of the grain was exactly the same as it was when they had first set off on their journey. The grain that was shared with the people was allegedly enough to feed them for 2 years. Okay, so that's St. Nicholas. According to legends, he was an incredibly generous saint. He had a heart for the poor, for the needy, for anyone who had no one to champion them or to speak up for them or to look out for them. St. Nicholas died in the mid-4th century and was buried in his church at Myra. By the 6th century, the shrine to him was a well-known and popular pilgrimage site. Now, in the 11th century, a group of Italian sailors arrived in Myra and they actually stole St. Nicholas's remains. And the reason they did this was that they were allegedly trying to protect St. Nicholas's relics from Muslim invaders. So the sailors removed the remains of St. Nicholas and took them to a place called Bari in Italy and reinterred him there. And this is actually one of the reasons why St. Nicholas became so popular in Europe during the Middle Ages, because his remains had been moved there. And today, St. Nicholas's remains are still in Italy in an 11th century basilica called the Basilica of San Nicola. Now, we might reasonably ask the question of whether or not we can be sure that the remains interred in Italy are in fact the remains of St. Nicholas of Myra. It's a great question. And really, we can't know absolutely for sure that they're definitely St. Nicholas's remains. However, in the year 2017, researchers took a fragment of a piece of hip bone that had come from the site in Italy, and they dated it to the 4th century. So the remains in the Basilica of San Nicola are from the correct time period and could therefore very well be the true remains of St. Nicholas of Myra. And one other thing that potentially kind of adds weight to the idea that St. Nicholas is truly buried there is the fact that the tomb of St. Nicholas is said to have exuded for the last 1500 odd years a clear oil that has the distinct fragrance of myrrh, which is pretty crazy. So the actual city of Myra is named after the myrrh tree. And apparently ever since St. Nicholas's body was buried, his tomb has exuded this oil that smells of myrrh. Apparently this phenomenon began while St. Nicholas's body was still in Myra, and it continued even after his relics were moved to Italy in the 11th century. And today, people still go on pilgrimages to Bari in Italy in order to receive a blessing from the myrrh-scented oil. Okay, so that is St. Nicholas of Myra. And this is the saint on which the modern day Santa Claus is based. So how do we get from St. Nicholas, a Greek bishop from the 4th century, to Santa Claus, a red-robed, white-bearded man who's like, ho, ho, ho? Well, the kind of key to the relationship between St. Nicholas and Santa Claus can be found in the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas. Apologies to any Dutch listeners for probably wildly mispronouncing that word. So the feast of Sinterklaas is the feast of St. Nicholas. Now, Sinterklaas, St. Nicholas, is depicted in the Netherlands as an elderly bishop who has white hair and a long white beard and who wears a red cape over a white alb, which is a priestly vestment. He also wears on his head a red mitre. So a mitre is like a traditional headdress of bishops. And he carries a golden staff. He also carries a big red book. And in that book, he keeps a record of which children have been good and which children have been naughty in the last year. So that is the figure of Sinterklaas. And his feast day is celebrated on the feast of St. Nicholas, which is the 6th of December. So Sinterklaas is a figure associated with the 6th of December. Now, on the 6th of December, and this is true in many countries and not just in the Netherlands, children will often leave their shoes out the night before the feast day so that St. Nicholas can come and fill their shoes with coins or sweets or small gifts. And this tradition arises out of the fact that St. Nicholas was a generous gift giver. In fact, there are stories of St. Nicholas secretly placing coins in the shoes of children when they were left outside. So that's where that tradition comes from. And that's celebrated in many places around the world, including in the Netherlands, on the 6th of December. Now, in the 18th century, Dutch settlers brought the tradition of Sinterklaas to America, and specifically to the New York area, which used to be known as New Amsterdam. So Dutch immigrants continued to celebrate the feast of Sinterklaas with their children. And over the time, that name Sinterklaas in Dutch was gradually anglicized to Santa Claus. He also gradually became associated with the 25th of December, Christmas Day, rather than the 6th of December. And the reason for that had to do with the Reformation. And during the Reformation, Protestants deliberately placed less emphasis on veneration of the saints. And so saints' feast days weren't celebrated as often. In fact, Martin Luther explicitly encouraged people to celebrate that practice of gift giving, which usually was associated with St Nicholas's feast day, on Christmas Day instead. And the reason for that was to try to shift people's focus away from St Nicholas and onto the child Jesus. And in fact, Martin Luther suggested that the bringer of gifts on Christmas Day shouldn't be St. Nicholas. Instead, it should be the child Jesus. However, St. Nicholas was already such a popular figure that he remained as the bringer of gifts, but he just brought them on Christmas Day rather than on the 6th of December. So gradually this tradition of Santa Claus, derived from Sinterklaas, bringing gifts for children on Christmas Day became more and more popular in North America. The image of Santa Claus also evolved over that time. So the modern kind of American Santa Claus began to take shape during the 19th century. So in the year 1809, an American author called Washington Irving wrote a book called A History of New York. And in that book, he referred to St. Nicholas as Sinterklaas and described him as a jolly figure. A few years later, in 1821, another book was published in New York that contained an anonymous poem called Old Santa Claus with Much Delight. And this poem described the figure of Santa Claus riding a sleigh that was drawn by reindeer and bringing rewards to good children. 2 years later, in 1823, a very famous poem was published for the first time. This poem was titled A Visit from St. Nicholas, which is probably better known today as The Night Before Christmas. So I'm sure we all know the poem. 'Twas the night before Christmas, and all through the house not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse. I think probably most people can quote at least the first line of that poem. It is so famous. So this poem was published anonymously, but was probably written by Clement Clarke Moore. And it really concretized and helped to shape the modern image of Santa Claus. So in this poem, St. Nicholas is described as a chubby and plump, right jolly old elf with a little round belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. And he's described as riding a sleigh that is also pulled by reindeer. So this poem was wildly popular and really became the catalyst for the modern concept of Santa Claus as the jolly old man who brings presents and good cheer to children on Christmas Eve. Over the course of the 19th century, this image of Santa Claus continued to develop. So one thing you've probably heard is that Santa Claus started appearing in advertisements for Coca-Cola during the 19th century. And in those advertisements, he was the white-bearded man with the red suit with the white trimming, basically the Santa that we all recognize today. Other poems and stories that were written in the 19th century, often by American authors, included other kind of trimmings, such as the character of Mrs. Claus, or the elves who live with Santa and help him to make his presents. The tradition also developed of Santa Claus living in the North Pole. The reason for that was that during the 19th century, the North Pole was pretty much the most distant, exotic, inaccessible place in the world. It was thought of as a kind of magical, inaccessible location. So that kind of made it the perfect secret home for Santa Claus to live in, where he could be in isolation, making his presents throughout the year, ready to deliver them on Christmas Eve. So that's how we get from St. Nicholas and celebrating the feast of St. Nicholas on the 6th of December to Santa Claus who brings presents to children on Christmas Eve. Cool. So what about today? Because the figure of Santa Claus today is obviously quite different from the figure of St. Nicholas. And one common question that Catholics often have, especially when they have children, is should we be promoting the image of Santa Claus? Should we be telling our children that there is a Santa Claus or telling them that Santa Claus is going to bring them gifts? Well, the Catholic Church doesn't have any particular kind of stance on this question, apart from encouraging Christians not to tell lies. And this is one reason why some parents prefer not to tell their children about Santa Claus, because they feel like they are lying to their children and misleading them. Other people, on the other hand, argue that the idea of Santa Claus isn't so much a lie as it is just part of like the imaginary life of children. So Santa Claus is kind of like superheroes and dragons and fairies and the other kinds of stories that children tell and enjoy and eventually grow out of. So there's kind of arguments to be made on both sides, and it really is up to individual parents whether or not they want to tell their children about Santa Claus. One thing though that every Catholic parent can do is to tell their children about St Nicholas and tell them stories about how he was generous and had a particular love for the poor, and we can use this story to help children develop that attitude of generosity and giving around the period of Christmas time. Having said that, this tactic can backfire. And I am speaking from personal experience, because apparently when I was about 4 years old, my parents sat me down and very gently told me that once upon a time there was a man called St Nicholas, and he had died a long time ago, but he was a saint who lived in heaven, and he's the person that we've based the idea of Santa Claus on. So if you want to, you can pray to him for the presents that you want on Christmas Day. Mum and Dad thought they had done an incredible job of breaking the news to me about Santa Claus without completely rocking my world, and I seemed to take it really well. I was like, sweet, okay, there's such a person as St Nicholas and I can pray to him. Apparently the next day I went to preschool, got up in front of my whole class and told them, my parents said that there used to be a Santa Claus, but he's dead. And my parents got like a stressed out phone call from the preschool being like, what did you tell your child? Everyone's in an uproar. So be careful with how you explain it to your children. But the story of St. Nicholas can be a very helpful way of encouraging generosity and prayer around the time of Christmas. Sick one. Okay, well, that's it for this week and also for this year. I'm going to be back in the new year with our next deep dive, which I am so excited for. I can't wait. It's going to be a really good one. And in the meantime, I hope you have a fabulous Christmas and a wonderful new year, and I can't wait to talk to you soon. Okay, bye. Sleep, little baby, underneath your star. Sleep, little baby, I know who you are. You are Mary's sweet child. You are the Son divine. You are my only Savior. You are a friend of mine. Sweet, gentle Savior, angels at your head. Sleep, gentle Savior, on your humble bed. You are heaven's treasure, sent to earth for me. You are the most precious gift beneath the Christmas tree. Following the distance are the wise men come to pray, and the humble shepherd folk at your holy feet we stay, watching, loving, adoring through the night. So sleep, little baby, sleep tight. Thanks, Mom.